in the eye of the storm, freedom of religion, and freedom of assembly during the pandemic. This is your host, Woody Jenkins. We'll interview attorney Jeff Wittenbrink and Reverend Tony Spell. Welcome. How are you?
We're doing great. Thank you for conducting this interview, Woody. And it's good to be here with attorney Jeff Wittenbrink as well. I'm Pastor Tony Spell.
Honored to be here. My name is Jeff Wittenbrink. I always like to say in answer to your question, Woody, better than I deserve.
That's right.
Jeff, your client here, Reverend Spell, has something, I believe, unique. In the last 90 days of this pandemic, we had the governor issue many emergency orders that he claimed had the force of law, that people could be arrested and prosecuted. But of the 4.5 million people in Louisiana, I believe only one person was actually arrested, and that's your client, Tony Spell. Is that the case?
I believe that that's true, Woody. I think Pastor Spell, well, of course, was arrested and cited with 6 different citations of violation of the governor's orders, his emergency orders, and then rearrested again later on another charge, basically stemming out of the circumstances that those orders created. And by, say, the circumstances, the fact that he was under constant surveillance morning, noon, and night by cameras that were erected around his home, watched and followed by members of law enforcement and other people. So during that period of time, though, in Louisiana, at least according to media reports that I see, I think he's been the only one in the state of Louisiana that an enforcement action has been brought against.
And the actual crime was that he had the audacity to continue to have church in the church that his grandfather and he have pastored continuously for the last 62 years.
Yes, I believe that's correct. That was the actual reason for the citations, certainly. And then, of course, in the other arrest, he was arrested and placed under house arrest for violating the court's order not to do it anymore.
Now, Pastor Spell, just tell us, with so many churches closing, so many having online services, why did you decide to continue to have services in the church, and even to the point of defying court orders?
Yes, it was never an option for us as to whether or not we would cancel in-person church services. Number one, we have a conviction. The pressure of our friends, family, lawsuits, jail, and death does not stop a man from operating in his conviction. Also, we have the Word of God. A commandment is stronger than an amendment and a governor's emergency orders. And we stand on the Word of the Lord, Hebrews 10:25, that says, do not forsake the assembling. The word is synagoguing together. Psalm 22:22, Psalm 22:25. So we have all these scriptures in the Word of the Lord that commands us to go to church, assemble, preach the Word. Online streaming was never an option for us. The majority of our church does not have the ability to view us online. We provide so many services for our city and our nation. So those were never options.
But let me ask you, a lot of Christians and even some pastors have cited Romans 13:1 as saying that they felt an obligation to abide by the law of the land.
Right.
And whatever the governor said, they considered the law of the land. How can you ignore that?
So, number one, Romans 13 was not a civil government that Paul was referencing. That was 100% church governance. That was written to the church at Rome. So Paul in no way insinuated that you should obey a government who was tyrannical. Number one, it wasn't written about civil government. If it was, then Romans 13:4, then we have to believe that Mao Zedong, Joseph Stalin, Adolf Hitler were all the ministers of God, and we should have obeyed those ministers. Of course, we know that that is ludicrous, that we should obey any of those evil dictators. So that was 100% apostolic church governance in Romans 13. So the reason we say that we're not defying any law, we're not breaking any law, is because the Word of God is on our side.
One thing that you did, you actually gave a sermon about that, and you asked that we put that on the screen, so I'm going to do it.
Yes.
Romans 13 and the coronavirus, and people who may desire to have a copy of that sermon,
Yes.
they can write into Life Tabernacle at 9323 Hooper Road,
Yes.
and I understand that you will send that to them.
It's a great, great sermon that's been compiled, and we offer that to people free of charge. You can actually click on a button here in this book and watch that sermon live. Should Daniel have obeyed the king that said stop praying? Should Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have obeyed the king that said bow down? Should Rosa Parks have given up her seat? Should the patriots at Concord Bridge thrown down their rifles and refused to fire the shot heard around the world? Should we have caved to an unjust governing order that says stop going to church? So the misdemeanor summons arrest states violation of the governor's emergency orders. Well, I'm sorry, but Mr. Governor, your jurisdiction stops at the door of our sanctuary. And we need to, as Americans and Christians, say, state has no right in our church.
Well, you not only were ordered not to go to have church, but you actually were arrested,
Yes.
booked into the parish jail,
Yes.
and when you were released, further ordered not to have church, and
Right.
The judge actually had an ankle bracelet attached.
Right.
It was we're here in your office at your home, and it was just in the other room,
Right.
and you wore that for about 21 days.
21 days, we were not allowed to leave the front door, back door of our home. Of course, that Sunday morning, they put it on me Friday. That Sunday morning, we went to church and preached. That was 540,000 people reached in that service via the live stream, the most viewed church service in America. I think a lot of them were watching because they knew we were going to be arrested. Of course, we were arrested again, cited each time. However, we stood on the word of the Lord. It was never an option. The judge told me, you do not have the right to preach to your assembly. That is prohibited. You and 9 people can be in the Louisiana Superdome together, but no more. If you do, you're in direct defiance of the governor's emergency order. That's an immoral law. That's an unjust order that you've given. And you can go everywhere else in Baton Rouge except to church.
So Jeff, now we have some important litigation that you have filed in federal district court, and I suppose also in state district. You filed it in federal district court, but now you're before the Court of Appeals, and also in state district court. Tell us where the litigation stands and what the real issues at stake are for religious liberty and freedom of assembly.
So the first thing we did, and I'm with a team of lawyers, including Judge Roy Moore, a former Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court, and his lawyers at the Foundation for Moral Law. And they've been mostly in charge of the federal court litigation, though I helped a lot with the drafting of the initial petition. We petitioned the court here in the Middle District for an injunction to disallow the governor or anybody on his behalf from enforcing these laws against the church and against Tony. And so we filed that, and Judge Brian Jackson denied our injunction. So right now, presently pending in the Court of Appeals, is a petition for an injunction pending the appeal. In other words, we've gone back and asked the Court of Appeal for the same injunction to enjoin the governor from enforcing these orders or anybody from enforcing these orders on his behalf. And that has been opposed. The governor has moved to dismiss that motion for an injunction pending the appeal and filed a motion to dismiss, and we have to answer that motion to dismiss by Wednesday, and the Court of Appeal intends to rule or at least have the entire matter submitted by Friday. So all those things were submitted. We submitted our motion for the injunction. Governor has responded as of last Friday, and then probably by this next Friday coming, we'll have some kind of decision. But we anticipate some victory before the Fifth Circuit and before the state court. We have pending before state court a motion to dismiss these citations that were issued against the pastor. And all of that is based on some unique aspects of Louisiana law that differ and distinguish us from other cases that the federal courts have been deciding. Louisiana, as you know, Woody, is uniquely positioned with a very, very strong Declaration of Rights that not only has a negative proclamation, thou shalt make no law, or no law shall be enacted to
violate freedom
of religion, violate free exercise, or establishment of religion. But not only is there the negative prohibition, but there's an affirmative duty on behalf of the governor and other elected officials to preserve those rights inviolate, which means that they're not supposed to violate them. They've got a duty to uphold them.
It says the rights enumerated in this article, the Bill of Rights or Declaration of Rights, shall be preserved inviolate by the state.
Right.
So this is the duty of the state, which is just not found in any other constitution, I don't believe.
Right.
So if you look at the decision coming out of the state of California, where the Supreme Court actually upheld some very draconian rules.
That's correct.
By the governor of California, that would not seem to bode well for Reverend Spell in the Fifth Circuit. But what you're saying is that because of Louisiana law, we may have an edge here, but could that affect the federal proceeding as well, or only the state proceeding?
Well, it certainly can affect the federal proceeding, because the federal court will look at the fact that, they deferred to the governor's power in the state of California. That's exactly what happened in the United States Supreme Court decision. The Supreme Court said, hey, the governors have great power under this particular statute that they have there, and we're going to defer to that because it's an emergency, because of the pandemic, et cetera, et cetera. So they deferred to the California statutory law that gave the governor this power. In Louisiana, of course, our governor is acting also under a legislative authorization under an Emergency Powers Act that gives him authority to make these orders, quote, with the force of law. But the fact of the matter is that power is limited by the very statute that the governor is relying upon to make the orders. In fact, that the statute that he relies upon says that nothing in the act gives him the right to diminish, that means lessen in any way, the rights of Louisiana citizens under the Declaration of Rights. Further, it goes on to say that the legislature still has all of its power, and of course the judiciary still has all of its power. So as you know, Woody, being an expert on this subject, the fact of the matter is the governor doesn't have any authority to do a lot of what he has done, but especially with regard to religious freedom.
Well, actually what happened, I was serving in the legislature in 1970, or rather 1993, when the Emergency Powers Act was considered. And it was so far-reaching, I was deeply concerned about the language in it, as were others. And so we drafted this section, I think it's RS 29736D.
That's correct.
And it specifically says, nothing in this entire act shall diminish in any way the rights enumerated in the Declaration of Rights of the Louisiana Constitution or the Bill of Rights of the U.S. Constitution. So that would include freedom of assembly and freedom of religion. So the governor specifically has that taken out. But there's some other aspects of that too that I thought were important. We said nothing herein shall diminish the powers of the legislature under the legislative article, or of the judiciary under the judicial article. So really, our thinking was that the governor would have emergency powers, but it would be over the executive branch and local government. It would not be over your basic rights, and it would not be over the legislative branch or the judicial branch. So that may give the governor here a lot less power than the governor in California did, as interpreted by the federal courts.
Certainly, as you look at the California statute and what we have in Louisiana, it's very different. And Woody, even the governor seemed to recognize that if you look at the very first order that he made, because his very first order dealt only with his powers with regard to the executive branch. The very first order that he promulgated talked about the fact that it was an emergency, but it gave all these different orders to members of the executive branch and different agencies and what those agencies could and should do. during the course of this emergency. So I believe that initially when things started out, the governor at least had an idea or was being advised about the limitations of his power. I just think that as time went on, they proceeded to test the waters.
What is really at stake here, Jeff, for churches, for religious people around our nation, for the First Amendment? What's really at stake in the litigation that you have?
So what's at stake in the litigation is nothing less than the ability of churches to freely assemble and freely worship. You know, the meaning, the Greek word for church, ecclesia, means assembling of gathered people together for worship. Right. And so that's where the word church comes from. The very essence of church is assembling to worship God. Mm-hmm. And so that's literally what's at stake. You know, Woody, after this pandemic is over, there's going to be a flu next season that could be as bad or worse. There will be viruses to come, other emergencies that occur. And you have to ask yourself, if the governor can accrue these kinds of powers by simply declaring an emergency. And by the way, there's great financial incentive for the governor to declare an emergency. You can never overlook the fact that the federal government has allocated all kinds of money, $2 trillion, to be spent for emergency purposes. So when the governor jumps out and declares an emergency, well, there's automatically a pipeline for extra funds to balance the budget, to handle things having to do with the emergency, and they always then are able to shuffle other monies around to handle the things that they want to handle. That's how government works.
Well, in the whole history of our state and in the whole history of our nation, my goodness, we've had every sort of emergency.
That's right. That's right.
Flood, hurricane, diseases.
Annually.
Has this ever happened that the country was shut down, that our right to freedom of religion was taken away, that churches were closed? Is there any precedent at all for this?
Well, I've been told that sometime during the Spanish flu, that churches voluntarily were closed, that people didn't assemble. But I don't believe there's ever been such a wide sweeping shutdown of our entire country for an emergency.
And that was voluntary. That was not.
I believe that was voluntary.
Law.
That's correct. Not by. And I don't remember hearing about anybody being arrested or anything like that in the history of the country. And certainly, no one else has had these orders enforced against them in Louisiana.
This case, when it is heard by our higher courts, we're out of the district courts, and we're out of the state federal courts, and we're in the higher courts of appeals. Their rulings on this case will say we either have a First Amendment, or the First Amendment is an endangered species in America. Because the First Amendment, of course, didn't give us our right to have church and preach, right, but it protects our right.
It's supposed to protect our rights.
It's supposed to protect it, and the ruling has to be stated by our higher judicial system in America that says we overstepped our bounds. Right. We did not have the right to tell you, you did not have the right to assemble, you did not have the right to preach. We need that declaratory statement from judges and attorneys, more than an apology, more than reparations for all that's come against our church. 8 people have been terminated from their jobs for coming to church, right, to this church. Slander, defamation of character, constant surveillance. There's surveillance all over this property right now. Our phones are tapped, texts are captured, what have you. More than any of that, never apologize, but at least tell us, do we have a First Amendment or not? Right. And if we do, what you have done to us was unjust and unconstitutional.
Unfortunately, the Supreme Court in this latest decision really pulled far back from protecting our First Amendment rights.
Yes, sir. And
Justice John Roberts, presently the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, gave great deference to the California governor, mm-hmm, and their ability to make these kinds of unilateral decisions that I don't think were ever anticipated by the Founding Fathers. And it's a sad thing. You know, our Founding Fathers rendered us a constitution to protect what they believed were our God-given rights. Mm-hmm. And if you can't accept that premise, you don't accept the premise that there are rights above and beyond what the government protects, then you undermine the foundations of the country.
Our entire
And
nation.
I hate to say it, but there's a strong movement afoot in the country right now to do that very thing. And we see it happening all over.
Redefinition of marriage.
That's exactly right.
It's total encroachment upon the church's religious and civil liberties, what's been done.
Well, the churches and everyone's. You know, if we don't stand fast to support those liberties, they will go away.
Yes, sir.
You know, this is a precedent-creating situation, and regardless of the emergency, regardless of the situation, the founding fathers believed that religion, especially, was outside the jurisdiction of the government.
Right.
Statements by James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, all to the effect that the government has no business putting its nose in religion, telling people when they can go to church. That was Everson versus Board of Education back in 1947. As recently as that, the Supreme Court said that we can't. The Supreme Court and the courts have no jurisdiction to tell someone when they can or when they cannot go to church.
That's great.
Now,
Just essential.
Reverend Spell, you've expressed a lot of concern about the state of the church in America today.
Yes.
You've talked about the churches closing apparently so willingly.
Right.
And then the fact that so many are so slow to reopen. And the fact that they have been very much weakened financially.
Yes, sir.
And that there's been a fallout in mission support.
Oh,
Describe what you see, and what are some of your conversations with other pastors?
With pastors, national and global, Woody. That's what's happening to America's churches is happening globally right now. So number one, missionaries are not getting financial support due to America's church door closures because we support missions globally, financially. They are not autonomous churches overseas in communist nations, in Central American, South American nations. They need financial support, and they depend on America's churches to do that. So they are suffering badly. And something else, there are church members now after 90 days who are telling their pastors, whose pastors are telling me, we don't want to go back.
Right. They're frightened.
We enjoy there's a fear factor, but we enjoy the screen. You know, we can have church online for an hour or two, pay our tithe online. Why do we need to assemble again? We like this. We can have church on the boat. We can have church in Branson. So that's a whole new enemy that's encroached now America's pastors because a precedent has been set, a die has been cast. Something else is the faith of congregants that has been lost in their leaders because, you know, why did we not stand up?
Right.
Don't we have faith? Don't we have power? Don't we have rights? Don't we have commands? And so there's such an uproar from America's congregations right now, Jeff. And a whole other factor is, if you're still afraid, today is day 90 of this pandemic. Where are the coffins in Life Tabernacle? Where are the corpses? Shouldn't we have, I mean, they called us Death Tabernacle in some news feeds. Where are the dead people after 90 days? We baptized 102 as of Tuesday night. You have to touch people, baptize them, you know, there's human contact, shaking hands. There's people that never stop doing that. And we baptized several more this morning. So now the fear should be gone.
Right.
We should say, you know what? There's millions of people protesting and rioting, yet we can't go back to church. We're still limited. In California, our pastors, our apostolic pastors, still cannot have more than 50 or in-person church services, yet in their neighborhood, thousands and thousands of protesters are in a jumble with no mask, no social distancing. So this is a total hypocritical double standard being shown by our governors and mayors. The same governor and mayor that said on national television, we're going to shut that faith leader down, are now praising and promoting rioters in our city. Oh, they're standing up for their right to protest. Well, it can't be both and. It's got to be either or. You're either against assemblies or you're for them. For sure, don't show a double standard. So America's churches, people are actually disaffiliating from the largest Pentecostal organization in the world because their general superintendent and their leaders says you have to obey the government. You cannot have in-person church services. So they're having to disaffiliate with that organization so they can go back to church
Right.
legally as an autonomous church, which all churches should remain autonomous for that very reason.
Haven't we really seen a weakness in the church because
Yes, sir.
church attendees tend to be older?
Mhm.
It skews very old.
Right?
And yet, the people most vulnerable to this disease were older. And the
Right.
fear factor has been greater with the older people. So, in a sense, so many churches are left without a congregation to
Right.
attend. What's the answer? How do churches turn this around? I listened to you and your sermon this morning where you were talking about going out in the neighborhoods and finding
Yes.
the people. How do you do it?
So how we do it, we run buses, we knock doors on door-to-door evangelism every day of the week, in-home Bible studies, but all of that is connecting people to the church. Nothing will ever take the place of fellowshipping in person, shaking hands, hugging necks, greeting people, friendships, connectivity. People have actually been indoors for 13 weeks now, no social contact. Divorce rate is through the roof. Suicide rate is through the roof. Depression rate is through the roof because we as human beings were not meant to do that. That's where church plays the critical part in our society. It's more than just preaching and doctrine, but it's fellowship. It's breaking of bread together. It's praying together. So we're having to constantly break down the fear in our city, and we're inspiring people from New Jersey to Seattle to Los Angeles to Miami. People actually have driven in from 40 different states just to be in in-person church services. People are here today from Miami, Texas, Washington. So what are we doing? We're telling people we're going to do what we've done aforetime. We're going to keep having church, keep preaching, and nobody's going to take that right from us. It's an inalienable right, Jeff. Judge Roy Moore said it so eloquently. Inalienable means I can't give it up and you can't take it from me.
Right.
Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. So
Jeff,
what are we doing? We keep having church. Keep
Jeff,
on.
we just have about 2 minutes left. Tell us what's coming up now. What's the timetable, do you think, on this litigation?
So we should have a decision of some kind by the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeal very quickly on whether or not they'll grant us an injunction pending the full appeal. And then, so that's going to come out within the next week or two, I would say at the latest. We still have pending before the state court, which will eventually end up, I believe, in the Louisiana Supreme Court, just a motion to quash these bills of information, quash these citations against Pastor Spell completely, to get rid of these charges, because the fact is the governor didn't have the authority to issue the orders that he did. And so you can't be found to be in violation of an order that's unconstitutional or illegal.
Any other final remarks?
The final remarks that I would say is that other pastors need to follow the lead of Tony. He's been very brave. He's suffered a lot for it. But if the church were to stand up and to just say, we're going to go to church, I don't believe we would have gotten the decision that we got from Chief Justice John Roberts. I believe if 1/10, maybe even a 50th of the churches in America had said, hey, we're going to church, we're going to assemble, we're going to worship God. If they had done that, the politicians and the justices would have paid attention like they're paying attention to the people who are protesting in the streets right
Yes.
now.
Any final word, Reverend Spell?
Yes, it's mob rule in America right now. What happens when you close America's churches for 90 days? Cities are on fire. Police are forbidden to go into neighborhoods and answer calls against crime, rape, burglaries. They're forbidden to go in those areas. What did we expect when we stopped preaching, praying, and closed our church doors? Did we expect a Disney World and a happy place? No. It's mass pandemonium. These are the beginning of sorrows. And it's not over now when we get these rulings. It's not over. These are the beginning of sorrows. So the church had better be ready and brace themselves for what's coming. And join in the fight with us. Stand up for right and be a soldier for Jesus.
Stand up. That's what I would say.
Thank you both. It's a pleasure to have you today.
Thank you.
As the Central City News has discussed freedom of religion and freedom of assembly during the pandemic. I'm Woody Jenkins, your host.